Welcome. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight for this live event with K-Pop Dreaming. We are so happy to see you all. Welcome, welcome. First, a huge thank you to our partners at Gyopo for everything they did to help us bring this to life. They have been such an absolute joy to work with. So make sure you stop by their table outside and find out more about what they do, or visit their website at gyopo.us. They're incredible. You'll love it. Also, a thank you to JUMO Sojo cocktails, which I hope you have enjoyed. If you haven't yet, you can grab one at the bar. They're free while supplies last. Hang out, have fun, listen to DJ BOBA BEAR afterwards. And one more thank you to our sponsor, Kia. You can check out their sweet new ride outside. I think it's a Nero, and it's all electric. It's really lovely. And you can learn more about them at their table. So that's all the thank yous. Also, thank you to our ASL interpreter. Thanks so much for being here. Yes, amazing. All right, I'm gonna take a couple quick polls. Who here listens to us on LAist 89.3? Okay, fantastic. How about, do you read our stories at laist.com? Oh, you should definitely do that. It's incredible. The reporters are amazing. And who listens to our podcast from LAist Studios? I hope a lot of you, because that's why you're here tonight, right? Amazing. Well, thank you so much. Your support means everything, and it means that we get to do what we do fun stuff like this, but also bring you timely reporting, great stories. So thanks so much for your support. We have a bunch of upcoming events. May and April are jam-packed with a lot of great things. We have an event about the recently expired eviction protections. It's an AMA, it's next week. We have a really fun spring fling coming up on April 19th with our podcast Wild. It's gonna be great fun. So check out all of our upcoming events at laist.com/events. All right, so a couple more things. If you have phones that will make noise during this, just turn them off. We are recording for a podcast, so we don't want beeps and boops. And if there is an emergency, which we have not planned for, you can exit the same way that you came, or behind these curtains where it says exit right there. And that is plenty from me. So without further ado, please welcome our incredible panel for tonight, Michelle Cho, Jheanelle Brown, and the host of K-Pop Dreaming from LAist Studios, Vivian Yoon.
Hello! Thank you so much for being here. I'm Vivian Yoon. I'm the writer and host of LAist Studios podcast, K-Pop Dreaming. The podcast... Thank you, Michelle. So the podcast dives into some of the history and the origins behind the music. And we're going to talk about some of that history today, you know, specifically with regards to the role of US imperialism in K-pop and the role of hip-hop in K-pop. We're also going to talk about really fun things like diaspora. So let me introduce our lovely panelists. We have Jheanelle Brown, a film curator / programmer, educator. Yeah. She is also currently on faculty at the California Institute of the Arts and Otis College of Art and Design. And then we have Michelle Cho, professor of East Asian Popular Cultures and Cinema Studies at the University of Toronto, with specialties in South Korean film, TV, pop music and digital culture, transnational fandom, race and diasporic representation, platforms, and global media. Yeah. So I'm really excited to have both Michelle and Jheanelle here today because they actually helped us during the research process of the podcast. So it's going to be awesome. We're going to dive into a lot of things, and I think we should just jump in, right? Start talking. So in the third episode of our podcast, which is called Trot, we take a look at Japanese colonialism, which started in 1910 in Korea. And we see how Korean music evolved through the Japanese presence there. And we kind of touch on how, like, throughout the 20s and 30s, American music influences came into Korea, things like swing and jazz and the foxtrot and things like that. But then really it was after World War II when the U.S. military stationed itself in what was about to become South Korea, that we really got a much more like dramatic increase in American music and culture. And this is actually something you told us about, Michelle, in the very, very early stages of planning for the podcast, the impact that USO shows had on Korean music back then. I actually want us to play a video of a group called the Korean Kittens, who were a Korean group, performing at a USO show in Southeast Asia for American soldiers.
Yeah, mama, don't you tell me wrong. Come and look at that woman, yeah. Yeah, what I see, yeah. That's what I say. That's what I see, yeah. She the girl with the red dress on. She can shake the thing, yeah. Yeah, what I see, yeah. Tell me what I say. Tell your mama, tell your papa, I'm gonna send you Victor Arkansas, yeah, what I say, yeah.
Wow. Very surprising. I was so surprised when I first saw that clip because I just couldn't believe that kind of voice was coming out from this Korean woman singer. But tell us more about USO shows and how they impacted Korean music.
Sure. Well, I don't know, you all may be aware of the fact that the American military has been present on the Korean Peninsula since really the end of World War II, and then during and after the Korean War, which is not technically over, and that is why the military kind of stays and is still stationed there. And so since there are large populations of U.S. soldiers, there are musical artists, entertainers who come through who are there to entertain, often to kind of give soldiers a bit of the sound of home. And so there were a lot of Korean musicians who actually got jobs entertaining soldiers or jobs near bases, and they learned American musical styles in order to cater to their GI audiences, but also other Koreans became really interested in American musical styles. So the Korean Kittens, they're a great example of a group that kind of ran with the kind of popular soul sound, really. And yeah, it's pretty amazing how they sound and how they're able to kind of master the sound of American popular music from that time. But that's really how Korean musicians start to play this kind of music and run with it, and Korean ears sort of follow.
I mean, it's so fascinating because that song they cover is What I Say by Ray Charles. And the sound is so specific, right? And they really match it perfectly. I was kind of stunned, and I honestly still don't really know how to fit it into my brain sometimes of how am I supposed to feel about this. But it is really interesting because in the conversation about the role of Black American music and culture, there are so many layers like this, right? Where it really was a direct result of U.S. imperialism that I think is really fascinating. I don't know if you have any thoughts on what we just saw, Jheanelle.
I mean, I think that there's a lot that you just said that we'll get into later, so I don't want to preempt it.
Okay, great. Awesome. Yeah, so I mean, the other thing that you mentioned, Michelle, that I thought was fascinating was the economic impact that the USO shows had in South Korea too, which I wasn't aware of.
Yeah, I mean, I would say beyond just the shows, the economies that popped up that were really there to support the military presence. So whether that's venues or clubs and places that GIs would be able to go when they were, on break, or supply chains, just because after the Korean War ended, the domestic economy was quite weak. I mean, there was a period of time in which the country kind of had to rebuild itself. And so a lot of economic activity was actually spurred by and really fueled by the U.S. presence. So it kind of makes sense that these artists, they were drawn to this music and, wanted to learn how to perform it, but they also did it because they needed jobs, they needed work.
There was an economic
incentive.
reason. Yeah. And then, even groups now, like K-pop artists, from the second generation, third and fourth, they are still nodding to the importance of USO shows, right? So I think we have 2 clips that we're going to play. One is from Girls' Generation music video Genie, which we'll see right now.
Come on.
소원을 말해봐 네 마음속에 있는 작은 꿈을 말해봐 네 머리에 있는 이상형을 그려봐 그리고 나를 봐난 너의 진이야 꿈이야 진이야.
Okay, so that video is what, like over 10 years old now. I saw it a lot when I was like in college. I never knew that they were referencing like USO shows. I thought they just wanted to look like cute sailors in like really short shorts. So that was like really intentional.
Yeah. I mean, I think so to maybe give it a little bit of a framework, I think that what they are referencing is this idea of like a performance culture, like, being able to perform in those spaces was a way to reach audiences that were outside of just your locality, right? And then there's a certain kind of like excitement of almost like a celebrity culture, right? So, yeah, I think that K-pop groups might be referencing that sort of, spectacle. Yeah, that's definitely going on there in the Girls' Generation video for sure.
Yeah. Were you a fan of Girls' Generation?
Not particularly. I mean, well, really, no. I mean,
Yeah.
no shade. Yeah, come on, y'all, no shade. But it's really just that, like, when my fandom started, it kind of was like 3rd generation active. So
Okay.
it's really just, I think, a question of time. But I think something that's really interesting is to think about, and so I don't have answers, but like what is being signaled and what is being signaled in terms of the kind of like normalization of American militarism and imperialism. And so like, it's just, I think, a question for me of how to kind of like mediate and mitigate maybe the effects of those images in terms of just also furthering the kind of American imperial project, which, as Michelle just said, is still present and still very much kind of orders a geopolitical order, I guess.
That's really fascinating too, because I feel like the impression I have always gotten from K-pop, just as somebody who grew up with it, not as like a scholar or somebody who analyzes it for real, but I always got the sense that a lot of images and concepts and symbols are not given the same weight as maybe some of the ways that like artists here in the States might, because in the US, I feel like we have developed a language for analysis for media and culture in a way that might not be as advanced in South Korea or as like popular in mainstream discussions maybe. I don't know, I'm just guessing. I just see you smiling. I'm like, is what I'm saying completely wrong?
There's a lot of analysis
There
of
is.
K-pop.
Well, I mean, of K-pop, yeah.
Yeah.
But in terms of like the intentionality behind using some of these images, like are they aware of how loaded or significant they might be, right? I don't know.
So I think that for the domestic audience, K-pop groups still perform for Korean soldiers. Like the military is such a core part of, people's lived experience, because every male citizen has to serve for 18 to 22 months. It used to be 22 months, now it's 18. And so K-pop groups still perform in shows for Korean soldiers and for American soldiers. There's a joint forces. There's a security alliance in the region. So that kind of culture in the space, that context zone, it's not just in the 60s. It's not just in the mid-century. It continues today.
It's still super prevalent today.
Yeah.
Wow.
So what you saw in the Girls' Generation video, to relate it back to the Korean kittens, right? We see single gender groups, young performers kind of performing on stage. There's definitely a nod to that, like the idol group that we know of today. It has an origin in the performance groups. The Korean kittens were citing Motown,
Right.
You know, so there's also this kind of direct lineage of
It's all connected.
yes,
Yeah.
American groups and Korean pop groups as well.
We have another example of this too. A dance performance video by BTS. Okay, now that you said everything you said, I see that video very differently because I'm like, of course, like they are still performing for troops. Like, I don't know why I did in quotations. Troops, period.
I mean, I think that video is kind of interesting because those of you who are BTS fans, you know that the fandom is ARMY, and there's this kind of like military metaphor in the Bulletproof Boy Scouts, you know, 방탄소년단. There's a reference to this military culture, and again, military culture is part of everyday life for most Koreans. If you yourself are not a man who has to go serve, you have family members and, you know.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I think that there's a great point that Jheanelle brought up of the normalization of military culture, what that means and what that might do to a society. I think that there are a lot of people who, you know, they wish that military, like BTS didn't have to go away for a while to serve this in this way. But unfortunately, the political situation is still one of conflict, so they have to. But I think that when K-pop groups now remind us of this history, they're also maybe allowing us to like think it through in critical ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think like even Michelle bringing up the fact that like, you know, a lot of ARMY, a lot of BTS fans are bemoaning the fact that obviously there's a hiatus to their group activities. Like my hope is that it's an opportunity to really think through American imperialism and really develop a critical analysis of like what's going on in the world. And so there's this one kind of specific event that we can point to, members of BTS having to serve in the ARMY, but like hopefully it's a moment for people who are maybe more unaware of the history or kind of the current situation to think about what's happening. And we can tie so much to American imperialism. We can tie so much to the military industrial complex. And so we can tie it to this. And I really hope that people use this as an opportunity to think a little bit deeply about what this actually means in the context of our world.
Right. Yeah. Right. And so to take it back again in time to like the 80s and 90s now, you know, in the podcast, we have an episode called Moon Night, and it really looks at this one nightclub in Itaewon, this neighborhood in South Korea, that was right next to the U.S. military headquarters at the time. And this club, Moon Night, it was a spot for American GIs, but not just any American GIs, but specifically Black American GIs to listen to hip hop, R&B, New Jack Swing, all this music from the States. And it turned out that a ton of early K-pop legends hung out there. So I just want to play a clip of this Seo Boys music video, Hayoga, because they actually filmed this video inside Moon Night, the club. So we get to see what it looks like.
Yo, man, these guys can't dance, man. Come on, man, let's see these guys dancing.
Okay. What do we think?
I'm so excited to hear what audience members think when we're at that point. But yeah.
Do we want to do that now? Or?
Oh, no.
Oh, okay.
I'm watching your reactions.
Yeah. I'm interested. One side note, every time you say Moon Night, you sound exactly like you do on the podcast. So I have a moment because we met for the first time tonight, and I'm just like, It's just like,
so
you sound
funny.
exact, but specifically when you say moon, I don't know why. Cause you say, anyway, that's my like, okay. But, you know, kind of with where we kind of walked into this clip, you know, the fact of the matter is that the clubs were segregated. And so for me, it's so fascinating to think of then how the kind of racial politics of the West were being reproduced in this space in which Black culture becomes a kind of focal point, a central point, an aspirational point that we might unpack later in the conversation. But then, of course, Black people are at the bottom of a kind of racial political order. So then how is that reproduced? But then how is that tension, how are those things bumping up against each other when like Black music, Black cultural production becomes something that people aspire to or want to emulate, and particularly Koreans in this context, when it's clear that, you know, the clubs are segregated for a reason, these GIs are, you know, segregated. These things are bumping up against each other, and I'm really fascinated by what we can unravel when we think about these contradictions.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting to think about Korea's importance as a space where U.S. race relations are playing out and then being reproduced. So the Korean War was actually the first conflict that the U.S. participated in as, you know, the kind of leader of the UN forces with desegregated units. And so it was a space where, you know, Americans fighting shoulder to shoulder were having to also work out the ways that they were going to respond to this kind of change, you know, the social changes that were happening in the US concerning race relations. You know, there was a lot of resistance to that move, and also many ways that the racial hierarchy was maintained despite these changes that were occurring. And so, you know, having segregated spaces of leisure for GIs is one way that, you know, a certain kind of racial regime is being maintained, even though in official terms it's kind of supposed to be different, right?
Yeah.
It's supposed to be more equal. But on the other hand, I think it's also really important to consider that, you know, the racial hierarchies are going to be very nuanced in different places. So if we're thinking about South Korea of the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, you know, it's not the glittery, like, I don't know, techno culture that everything cool and delicious in America, in American minds is coming from, the way that, you know, the Korean wave is so great. It's a place that, you know, like Black soldiers and white soldiers are still Americans vis-a-vis the local population. And so the power dynamics are shifted accordingly.
Yeah, and this is something, you know, I mentioned in the podcast too, that as I was learning about Moon Knight and Itaewon in the 80s, I discovered that my dad was stationed there with the U.S. Army. So he was a Korean American soldier serving with the U.S. Army stationed in Korea. And he identified more with the American soldiers than the Korean locals who lived there. And when I asked him, is it true that the neighborhood was self-segregated? He said, yeah. And actually, so Itaewon, you know, the neighborhood, it looks like this big hill, and there's one main road that separates the establishments on the left and the right. And he said it was self-segregated among the soldiers, and it just so happened that the establishments for, you know, white soldiers were to the left of the main street, and establishments for Black soldiers were to the right. And my dad hung out on the left side of the street, and he said that soldiers, you know, on both sides referred to that main road as the DMZ, or the dark man zone. So these were all things that were instigated and kind of like upheld in a de facto ways within the U.S. Army. So they were bringing their own, that's what you're saying, their own racial dynamics over to South Korea, which end up permeating South Korean, you know, ways of thinking about race. And then I also want to talk too about how, we think of South Korea as having been subjected to occupation, right? Both by Japan and the US, but, the narrative is actually more complicated than that. I don't know if Michelle, you kind of want to talk about South Korea.
Yeah, I think I was interested in kind of sharing, I think what is a pretty complex and multi-layered set of colonial relations. So if we're talking about, we already talked a little bit about Japan having colonized Korea in the first half of the 20th century. And so Korea is a post-colonial nation, but it also can reproduce certain colonial dynamics with its neighbors. So this is not a well-known fact, but second to American soldiers, South Korean soldiers were kind of the force that fought in the Vietnam War at the highest level. So
On behalf of the American side.
yes. Right. So South Korea's post-war kind of recovery was actually pretty strongly bolstered by the Vietnam War because it was a way that the nation could receive funding, money, soldiers who were fighting on the side of the Americans were bringing, resources, supplies to South Korea. So that war effort was also part of the economic activity of South Korea. So there's a way that South Korea can both be simultaneously a formerly colonized space and also engage in some of the same kinds of, colonial or neo-colonial relations with its less developed neighbors, where it's going into these places, extracting resources and
enacting violence.
And
Migrant
trying to
labor,
establish hegemony too.
Yeah.
We also think about migrant laborers from Southeast Asia and how that kind of power dynamic in the country as well.
Yeah, we have some footage of South Korean soldiers in Vietnam during the war. There's no audio for this video, but let's see. There are so many more archival videos and photos of South Korean soldiers in Vietnam during this time. If you look them up, they're actually really, really upsetting because they did enact this sort of violence and massacres that the U.S. soldiers are known for, and it's just less known, like South Korea's participation during the war, which is really complicated when you think about how popular K-pop is now in Southeast Asian countries, right?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, I think South Korean popular culture's kind of dominance in that region is due to the fact that, South Korea's modernization story is seen as aspirational. And so, countries in the region, they want to become the next, Korean wave. But it also can cover over those more violent histories. And so, again, we're here to bring those to light and to make the consumption of the Korean wave, to make your consumption more thoughtful, perhaps.
Yeah, and then the thing that complicates all of these things even further is when you add the Korean diaspora into the mix of Korean Americans from America who grew up here. In the podcast, we have an episode where we kind of look at one of these groups called Solid, and they were the first Korean American group to make it big in South Korea. And they really brought over like the genre of R&B. But I really want to talk about this concept of diaspora, because when people talk about groups like Solid, they often refer to like these Korean American musical artists as like returning home to South Korea, when that necessarily might not be their home because they were born and raised in the States, right? So maybe we can just kind of take a second to unpack like what the idea of home is when we talk about diaspora. And maybe, you know, if one of you wants to explain what diaspora is, that would be cool.
I mean, it's such a, I can't, at this point, I can't give a textbook definition of diaspora because it's kind of a word that's contextual. Can I look to you, Michelle? I mean, you know.
Yeah, I mean, diaspora is a term that refers to, you know, a group of people who are leaving a point of origin and, you know, moving elsewhere, settling elsewhere. It's a term that it really, it initially refers to the Jewish diaspora, actually. So thinking about a collective, a community, a people that, you know, they are kind of homeless and so need to kind of go out and create home in other places. If you think of like a spore, like a, you know, spores that disperse into the air. It's a sort of metaphor for a people kind of going out and spreading out. I think the Korean diaspora is very, very interesting because migration has been happening from the Korean peninsula outwards to different regions for quite a long time, really since the late 1800s. People have been crossing borders, kind of looking for different opportunities for different reasons. There's usually, you know, push factors involved, like reasons why people would leave a home because they had to often. And I think Korean Americans can sometimes, because they only know their experience and maybe their parents' experiences, and they're not thinking about Korean diaspora as a broader phenomenon, but you know, there's a Korean Japanese diaspora, there's a Korean Chinese diaspora, there's a Korean Mexican diaspora, there's a Soviet Korean diaspora, right? So I think it can be really helpful to kind of open up the idea in ways that maybe you might not if you're just kind of thinking about your own kind of experience, and then it really pushes you to have to learn the histories, like why did people leave?
Yeah, the patterns of immigration and the impetuses, like why, right? Because it all ties into geopolitics, good old geopolitics. Jheanelle,
I mean, I have stuff to say related to my own diasporic identity, but if I can bring in a little bit of our conversation exists outside of this stage is, you know, something that I find so fascinating about the podcast period is how it's kind of, there's parts of it which feel to me like this kind of narration of your coming into consciousness as a Korean American person. I think that's fascinating. One of, I think, the main ways that I found myself as a fan of K-pop is as someone who's first generation, like I'm super fascinated by the like diasporic Koreans that like go to Korea and then like make a career in ancestral homeland, motherland, whatever you want to call it, because in my kind of like diasporic cliche existence of, you know, however you romanticize where your parents are from, where your families are from, like there's a part of me that like wants me and my sisters to like be able to go to Jamaica, live in Jamaica, feel like real Jamaicans, you know, whatever that means, like this romantic. But so I think like you kind of narrating that through the context of history and K-pop is super fascinating because I've sort of always wondered what it feels like to kind of, I've kind of been interested in maybe like, as someone is coming into like a diasporic not consciousness, but just like thinking about their identity in that way, like how does that kind of rub up against like, okay, well now K-pop and the Hallyu wave is a wave, it's hyper visible.
Right.
Like how does this kind of like, what's the just this arc of what Koreanness, how it's even read in the world, what it means
Right.
to people when in 2023, you know what I mean?
It is interesting. This event is put together in partnership with LAist and Gyopo. And Gyopo is the word that designates like Koreans who live abroad or grew up abroad, right? Who are not considered the same as local Koreans or native Koreans who have lived in the country their entire lives. And people have all kinds of different relationships with that word because it can be alienating. But for me personally, I totally identify as a Gyopo because I'm like, yes, I am American in ways that like South Koreans are definitely not. And when I go back to Korea, the first time I went back was in 2020, right before the pandemic hit. And I was miserable. Like I really was. And I hadn't been back to Korea in like, I would say 12 or 13 years since I was a kid, and the country had changed so much, right? Like all these new buildings, everything's high tech, everything's more efficient there. And all that stuff was great. But in terms of fitting in with the actual members of the society, I was instantly seen as a foreigner. People would avoid me. They wouldn't talk to me. And when I spoke in Korean, they would always have this funny look on their face because even though my pronunciation is like passable, it's like pretty good. Just, the diction and certain things just give away the fact that something is off and they can't tell if I'm just like, a little slow or what or something. But you can see people taking their time dealing with me. And it got so frustrating because I felt like I couldn't communicate and I couldn't reveal my own personality because of the language barrier. Like there were so many issues that came up during that trip to the point where halfway through, I just started speaking in English to everybody and signaling before as a defense, right? Like signaling to them that I am not one of you before you can make me feel like I'm not one of you. So it is very complicated and going back. And I wonder like if there is a concept in Jamaica that is similar to Gyopo or like people who live abroad.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think everywhere, you know what I mean? And I think that's kind of a universal trait of being first generation somewhere or first generation in the West. I have cousins. I have cousins that are like really good at speaking patois, Jamaican patois, which is an English Creole, and like they go back and kind of go into their patois, but like I'm not gonna do that, you know what I mean? Because I think my mom's watching this right now, and she was making fun of my sister and I the other day about it, but like knowing that that's not something that I should do. I'm personally not comfortable with that performance. But because it would be a performance at this stage. But another thing that I think is interesting, I don't want to get us too far afield, but of course, in like the last week's episode of the podcast, if people have listened, one of the things that topic was about the LA 92, the LA uprisings, also known as the LA riots. And I think, like thinking of that there are going to be nuances between, let's say, Koreans that just immigrated from Korea and the Korean Americans in terms of like some of the racial politics that flowered from what was going on, Rodney King being killed, Latasha Harlins being killed. But something that I've been thinking about is like, I do have to, although I'm Jamaican American, like me not being generationally American, I think that I like understanding your privilege as a diasporic subject, I think is really important. So even though you can't flatten, let's say, a Korean American and a Korean person in terms of identity, like I do think it's important to like be very aware of like your cultural heritage and how that kind of might set you up in terms of privilege. So like part of me understanding my diasporic experience is being very clear on the privilege that I have from my parents being from a nominally Black nation, right? And like the circumstances under which my parents came to this country, and being very clear about the space that I take up in spaces that are meant for African Americans and not for me, right? And so like that's hard because I'm still a Black person in America and all that comes along with it, right? But I still do there's nuances And it's important for me to be able to like be accountable to those in my kind of like project of like honoring Black people in all the ways that I think are important, to like know when to step back because of the privilege I have. So I do think, although again, I'm not a Jamaican national, it's important. So that's, I don't know, I feel like I'm ranting, or, you know, but like that's kind of, I do think that's important. So if I can maybe be a little bit more forthright, it's like, you know, maybe like asking for people to be conscious of power dynamics that you might inherit. And so, because I do think that shows up in tension, like let's say between Black folks and Koreans in LA, right? And so I would ask, like if I was talking to a friend, I would ask them to be cognizant, like a friend who is Korean American, I would ask them to be cognizant of like what's gonna happen in a liquor store. You know what I mean? What's gonna happen when I go to Ebony Wigs on Crenshaw, which is owned by Korean folks, right? So I think so much of this conversation for me is like thinking about power and also just having conversations that are a little bit uncomfortable.
Yeah.
You know? And so, yeah, that's I'm kind of going off, but yeah.
I think you raise a lot of really good points, and the thing that really sticks out to me is how individual the sense of identity and diaspora, and every person has a different relationship to the communities they come from and the communities they don't belong to as well. That's different too. Michelle, you're from Chicago, definitely not from LA, and you sort of had a different experience, right? Because I definitely like grew up in Koreatown surrounded by a ton of other Koreans, but that necessarily wasn't true for you.
Yeah. I grew up in the Midwest, and I kind of got the message early in life that I would have an easier time in school and with peers if I assimilated to a kind of, you know, generic American culture, which was kind of invisibly racialized, right? So white, more or less, but we didn't talk about that because we don't want people to be uncomfortable. So it's your description of your first time, or I don't know, going back
As an adult, my first time going back to Korea.
It really resonated with me because I went to Korea and I learned the Korean language in a competent way in my 20s. You know, I grew up having words, kind of speaking a child's Korean because that's the language I heard at home.
Right.
But then trying to develop a different relationship to it as an adult, and also a different relationship to Korea. But yeah, there's this desire for a sense of home, but it doesn't come automatically, right? It's not in your blood.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. Everybody has a different experience, a different story, and you know, you brought up 92, and I think it's so interesting looking at Tiger JK, the famous Korean rapper who is now known as like the godfather of rap in South Korea. He actually moved to the US from South Korea when he was 11 or 12 years old. He lived in Florida first, and then he came to LA during like high school, and he was in LA during the uprising, and he actually like ended up, you know, performing at this hip hop festival that was meant to like try and repair race relations or promote ethnic harmony, things like that. But I want to talk about Tiger JK's wife, who is another famous South Korean rapper named Yoon, and she goes by Tasha. Tasha was born to a Korean mother and a Black American father who was a US soldier. And she was born in Texas, but she moved to South Korea as a child. And, you know, both Tiger JK and Tasha have like commented on and spoke out against racism towards Black people in South Korea. So we have a clip of Yoon Mire's song Black Happiness. And we're just going to play the first verse and the chorus with the subtitles so you can see, you know, what she's really singing about.
유난히 검했었던 어릴 적 내 살색 사람들은 손가락질해 내 맘이 한테 내 바삐는 흑인 미군 여기저기 수근 때도 이렇군 저렇군 내 눈가에는 항상 눈물이 고여 어렸지만 엄마의 슬픔이 보여 모든 게 나 때문인 것 같은 죄책감에 하루에 수십 번도 넘게 난 내 얼굴을 씻었네 하얀 비누를 내 눈물에 녹였네 까마 피부를 나 속으로 원망해 와오와 세상은 나를 판단해 세상이 미워질 때마다 두 눈을 꼭 감아 아빠가 선물해준 음악에 내 혼을 담아 볼륨을 타고 높이 높이 날아가 저 멀리 La music It goes on and on and on 세상이 미울 때 음악이 날 위로해주니 So you gotta be strong You gotta hold on and love yourself
That's heartbreaking.
This track was really important because it was really the first direct kind of address to the Korean public to explain and kind of confront people with this experience. And so Yoonmire, Tasha Reid, she has such an importance as a musical artist who was able to do that. And so, yeah, I'm really glad that we were able to share that with you.
Yeah. Okay, so I really, really want to make sure we get to your... I want to talk about Jheanelle's essay because I feel like it touches on so many of these ideas. You wrote an essay called Too Much Emotional Trauma with My K-Pop. And it really...
That's what it is, y'all. I mean, I gotta be honest. Like.
Yeah, it's such a good read. Like, I highly recommend everybody go home, Google it. It's great because it really takes this idea, you really tackle this idea head on of like explaining your conflicting feelings about hip hop and rap in South Korean music. And you really point to some specific and very like provocative examples, you know, and I'd love for you to tell us more.
It's funny because that was like early on in my K-pop fandom. So even reading it now, there's like
More layers,
and even some stuff. Honestly, like that essay, there's a lot of okay, it's really complicated. But like I would prefer if a lot of people didn't read, you know what I mean?
Oh, okay.
No. Y'all are here, so it is what it is, and people. But like, there's some kind of like, because there is emotional trauma. We'll see some pictures of things that I think are like very just like triggering her black, but not like violent. Like we don't do spectacle of Black Death in these parts, but I just mean like some other things that we're gonna see, and it's like. But don't get it twisted, like, I'm a stan, you know what I mean? Like, Michelle and I were in Vegas for permission to dance. Like, you know what I mean? Like, y'all don't get it twisted. We're going to August D. All of that stuff is happening. Don't get it twisted, y'all. But that happens alongside all of the kind of, like, stuff we just talked about, right? Like how Michelle said, like, a thoughtful consumption of. But, for me, that was written, I think, a year or two after I got into K-pop. And at that time, I was like really into, I think it was Big Bang at the time, and YG groups. And YG groups are known for a very particular orientation towards hip-hop. But in the essay, I just talk about that, the kind of work of compartmentalizing that, all of that emotionally, which is like, feels like work and can be very confusing. And like, I really I do a very tight or like specific, I'm like losing my words because like it kind of is hard to like disentangle for me, but I perform a very specific dance of like how I talk about this. So with that essay, like I don't talk about it with a lot of Black people because I'm ashamed of the things I'm working out. You get what I'm saying? And like this event, I talk to people about it, but like I didn't post it on my social media, right? Because it's very conflicting for me. So in the essay, I talk about some of those things, and I don't know if we want to go to, I forget.
Jay Park's DNA.
Oh God. Oh yeah, that's what we're going into.
Yeah.
we talked about this, but I like forgot. But I mean, so later on, we'll see some pictures of you know. Yeah, we should go into that. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Let's see. We're gonna see a music video from an artist named Jay Park, and it's called DNA.
넘어져도 다시 일어나 나는 전설이지 내가 죽기 전에 미리 같이 사진부터 찍어놔 I stand on my 10 toes 두 다리가 여러 명 기둥이 되었지 머릿속 게을리 움직인다고 생각하면 시스템에 오르나 Solid lines when I got in my chest Morals and principles coming for checks 가도 두려해도 탈출했지 노예되기 전에 난 선택의 death 매년 판을 벌려 다시 기록 세워 나는 착한 사람 동시에 통장 채워 한국인 피가 흘러 절대 안 굽혀 Man it's in my DNA
And I mean, even that is like not the most egregious. And like, if you watch the whole video, the initial video was taken down because Jay Park got a lot of flack, and then I think he like reshot a different version. DNA being it is a remix or like an interpolation of Kendrick Lamar's DNA. But maybe I think maybe I might have more comments about that specifically later. But even just going back to the essay, I have a couple pictures of
Toki.
Yeah, Doki, who, so there's an interesting connection, which is kind of through the site of Show Me the Money, which is a South Korean like rap competition show. You can, in the style of like, let's say American Idol, you know, people are competing. And I think it was maybe season 5 of it. Jay Parker's partnered with another producer that got braids, like cornrows. And not only did he get cornrows, but the cornrows, or anyone knows the Slauson Swap Meet in South Central LA, there's video. I mean, I think it's fascinating, as like horrible as it is, like getting cornrows at the Slauson Swap Meet, which is like a very particular swap meet in place that kind of Black people congregate in South LA. And then also that same season of Show Me the Money, I think it's the first season where, and that's in the next picture, the first season in which there are auditions held in the US. Timbaland serves as a guest judge. Like the next season, I think they do it and they go to Queens and Swiss Beats as a judge. But anyway, this clip is of one of the producers, Kush, which is affiliated.
Can we see the photo again?
So this is him talking about there were some Black American contestants that auditioned, and this is him kind of talking about almost invoking like a kind of like savage image or association of like the Black contestants and their relationship to hip hop and how they kind of like take up space. Yeah.
Is this a producer? Who is this
so
person on
he
the
is
show?
one of the, so they have producers that like pair up, and they eventually, like once people make it past a certain rounds, they like are their mentors and they kind of usher them
So this
through
is
the
like a
competition.
producer
Yeah,
mentor
this is one of the
person
producers, and so he's
speaking about a
affiliated-
Black
yeah.
American contestant.
Yeah, and so this is like early on before they get to a place where they're paired up, but just like they have this. I was trying to find the clip shawl at 3 a.m. this morning, but I could not. But there's this part where like the Black contestants kind of, you know, they have them, it's obviously very constructed, so they have them kind of like introduced in a cut, and they're like walking against the background music is Wiz Khalifa's Black and Yellow, a very...
Yeah.
I tried to find the clip. Anyway, but so yeah, so the kind of, it's, so seeing things like that, like Doki get it, like Black hair, as I'm sure even just people know from observation, is a very particular thing that we're very protective of. Doki, and the Slauson Swap Meet is like not too far from me. It's just there's layers that I find fascinating, funny, but also, but like getting his hair done in cornrows at the Slauson Swap Meet, and him also being paired with Jay Park, this Korean American man, and I kind of wonder, like, as someone who grew up in America, like, did he know that like that was messed up, that he
So
had
Jay
that
Park,
hairstyle?
that's the person who did the DNA music video that we saw, and he's a Korean American rapper who has gotten in a lot of trouble and faced a lot of criticism for cultural appropriation, like specifically.
And so that goes back to this, what I was saying about diaspora and about kind of like, you know, Jay Park is someone performing Black music, hip hop and R&B is Black music, right? What is the kind of accountability or responsibility one has to like navigate things that can be called appropriation or anti-blackness or all these things.
Right.
And so I kind of see that in the text of a little bit of what I just showed of Show Me the Money. Yeah.
There's so much to dive into.
We're not going to get to all of it.
I
yeah.
feel like we could do like a 3-day conference and like go through all of these and just like everybody meets each other and becomes friends and family. But, you know, we also wanted to show this video, but you know, J-Hope, he also did a collaboration with J. Cole, who he like got his name from. There's that music video. So there's still a lot of like collaborations happening, and there's just a lot of layers to unpack. But, you know, I think we're getting towards the end of our conversation. So I really want to open it up to audience questions. If anybody has a question, feel free to raise your hand, and there are people who will be coming by with mics. I see a question in the back over there. And this is being recorded, so please make sure to speak clearly into the mic.
Hi, I'm sort of kind of an avid BTS fan as well, and anyone who's sort of kind of familiar with like the early stages of the band can very much speak to some very weird, like just weird racist kind of vibes. And I sort of kind of wonder, like, as a K-pop stan, like how sort of kind of do you sort of kind of defend sort of kind of, I guess, like your stan or your idol, and like, do you even feel the need to defend them?
That's a great question. And I think that's like an everyday kind of experience of, you know, being a stan or part of the fandom. And like, I feel very conflicted. Like, one thing that I think about is like, okay, you're gonna know what I'm talking about, but like the rappers in BTS, like I think they're phenomenal rappers, right? And there are times where I'm like maybe talking to a friend or something, and I want them to be like recognized as really good rappers. And what I'm saying is I want them to be recognized as being really good at performing an art form which is Black, and I'm never going to undermine that fact. But then I'm like, what does that mean? Like that's the conflict. For me, I'll say this. I live here. I went to Lollapalooza. Like that's what's going on with me, right? I got on a plane. We were there only for J-Hope's set, and so it was the monkeypox, but I was like, I'm there, and I didn't get it. It was all safe. It was all good. But like for me, okay. So if anyone watched the live stream or whatever, the person who performed before him was the Kid Laroi. He's a white Australian. A rapper. So he performed, J-Hope performed, and the Kid Laroi there were moments where he was like speaking in AAAV, African American Vernacular English, like very much performing a version of Blackness. And then J-Hope performed, and what I saw was not that. And that was something that felt somewhat redemptive for me to witness, like the Kid Laroi as a foil to, so neither of these people are Black, right? But they're both rappers. But like, so I do sometimes have this like desire to defend, but then it bumps up against all these other things I talked about. So I don't have an answer because they're always bumping up against each other. And I feel really weird about it all the time.
Here's a question in the front.
Hi there. One thing I thought was really good in the podcast was this discussion of particularly this cultural appropriation question, where you talk, because there's often this criticism of sort of K-pop idols like imitating Black culture, but this sort of the Moon Knight episode really dug into this, and I thought particularly the reference to the Gap Band outstanding, right? And so that there's actually this, I think we sort of, again, there's all these layers to unpack, that there is this sort of problematic episode of like the hairstyles and stuff, but then there's also this deep appreciation that is sort of, you could almost, that is sort of in this way deeply authentic of these Korean artists who grew up, and so they have this similar relationship to this culture that is not theirs in a way, but they make it theirs, right? So they're not just imitating something; they're actually creating it in a new way.
Yeah, thanks for that comment. I think, when we were sort of talking about the Jay Park clip and Jay Park, the lyrics that he's saying are, about being proudly Korean while he's performing in this, mode that is
Decidedly something else.
Something
Yeah.
else. But he's like, the whole argument of the song is, I, through my embodiment, can make this mine, which is a very specific way of thinking about culture and kind of essentializing it, So there is such a complicated set of attitudes and approaches, and they're not all the same. And so if we're thinking about, like what might be different about J-Hope's relationship to hip hop and Jay Park's relationship to hip hop or Black culture, there's no claim on the part of BTS's rappers that they are a new breed of hip hop star, or they are authenticating Korean hip hop through their bodily mastery of this aesthetic, or, there's no attempt to like replace and exclude.
Claim ownership over.
Yeah. There's a kind of the collaborations are, I think, an effort to show solidarity as opposed to, I'm gonna do it better than you all, and you don't need to be here. Like, we don't need the Black rappers on, like,
Wow.
yeah, being featured on Show Me the Money.
But just real quick with the first question over here, I do want to, with what you said about the kind of initial phases being appropriative, yeah, definitely. So, and that's not when I got into them. I probably wouldn't have gotten into them if that's what I saw, right? But so I think even just like, maybe me as a fan, like accounting for growth as a way to like feel somewhat better about it, I think it's what exists for me to be able to like move through it. Yeah.
Any other? Okay. Oh, now we have a bunch of hands. Let's go back to this side. Becca, I'll let you choose the lucky person.
Hey, another BTS stan here. I have a question. Do you think that, we were talking about how BTS became more cognizant maybe of the cultural appropriation. Do you see that other K-pop artists are growing in their understanding of paying homage to someone versus appropriating something and taking ownership of it? Do you see that other... because we're Americans, we can see that so much more clearly than maybe Koreans. Do you think that that's something that is changing within the K-pop industry?
I think it's definitely changing in the fandom. I think when you see South Korean like YouTubers and people who are commenting on things, that conversation has changed completely. I think there are a lot more like creators and influencers who are now aware that like blackface is wrong, things like that, and like are not sticking up for that. That's sort of the change that I've seen. I don't know what you guys think.
I think that especially after 2020, when fans, the change is actually quite fan driven. I give a lot of credit to fans who are speaking up and trying to make this more of a conversation within fandoms. And K-pop companies, they really pay attention to what fans are talking about. And so that's kind of one salutary way that fan discourse can improve or positively impact industry practices. So I think that some companies got the message that they had to learn a bit more, and that Blackness is not just a costume. But I can't say that I'm super confident that everybody is.
It's very case by case.
I
feel
educated about it.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so I think we have time for one more question. I see some hands on this side.
Hi, my name is Rianne. I identify as 1.5 Filipino American, and I'm wondering about this idea of like when we go back to our home countries, we get rejected for being American, but then there's a part of being American that's so cool and romanticized, and people make money off of it. So can you help me understand why that happens?
I mean, it's about power. So, Korean Americans they have a tough time when they go back to Korea, and especially if they're expecting a frictionless experience where they finally feel like they fit in somewhere, right? So there can be a lot of pain to that experience, but there's also, speaking English gives you power.
Yes,
That's
it
why
does.
it can be a kind of good shield for
That's what I experienced.
the feeling, of being rejected or not totally included. And so it's about, the U.S. is the global hegemon still, even though we're talking about the end of the American century or American hegemony, wealth, influence, American culture is still the dominant kind of popular culture around the world that's exported, right? So that carries a certain kind of, cultural weight. So it's not just all one thing like disempowerment, it's also empowering, right? To be recognized as an American.
Yeah, I really do think that it's American media, like the cultural dominance that America has had for the last few decades is
And economic and military.
yes, but for lay people, they're not thinking about economic and military power so much as everybody knows the big American blockbusters, but not, everybody in South Korea, they'll go to the cinema and watch the latest Batman movie or whatever, but it's not mainstream Americans are going to rush to the theaters to see the latest Korean blockbuster hit. And I think that disparity is so important when it comes to average people, that even when I went, the resistance that I was met with when I was speaking English, right? And people would clam up, and I knew what I was doing. I'm ashamed to admit it, that was my defense, but I knew that they would almost become bashful and shrink down because they felt inferior in their inability to speak English as well, which comes from this pretty messed up, power dynamic of between the two countries and cultures. And that I think is really true. And it's sad that it worked so well for me. Yeah.
But we're talking about it, and that's great, because I don't think that was happening until pretty recently, so.
Yeah. It's complicated, but, the thing that I really learned through the podcast is that as Korean Americans, Filipino Americans, we occupy a different space, and it is completely valid, and we have our own history, and it's up to us to validate that space for ourselves and not feel inferior to or make anyone else feel inferior to us, right? Okay, great. Thank you all so much. Thank you so much for spending this evening with us. I just want to thank Michelle and Jheanelle again so much for being here tonight for this discussion. And I want to thank LAist and Gyopo for hosting. This has been so great. There is going to be snacks and drinks outside. DJ BOBA BEAR is spinning, and we're also going to head out there in a few minutes. So if you want to keep chatting with us, we will be there. So we'll see you right outside. Thank you again.